Chapter 15 to 21. It only took one wizard to break the mold of a brainless sheep and take the only path that was left for them, that of a dark wizard. Trying to influence the wizarding world to become a more tolerant place was a recipe for disaster. Almost as bad as somehow giving muggles magic. The retards in those fanfics were truly naive fools if they thought they could make everything better with everyone having magic. Did they not know how many people were in the prison systems? They would all become Dark Lords, and this was not including all the egotistical wish-fulfillment people like Chad himself coming out of the woodwork. The world would end in under a year. Muggles already hate each other enough and find creative ways to kill themselves as it is without magic to help them. Imagine magical biological or chemical warfare, magically infused atomic bombs or bludger-like missiles. Not to mention all the mind-raping that would be going on. No, humanity was already a cruel and violent beast without magic, and the magical humans too stupid to take advantage of it. But mostly, Chad didn't want the competition. All the negative reasons he had just thought of not to give the mundanes magic were things he planned to exploit. The piece de resistance of his plans were that 80% of them were not even against the law. Well, the magical law, and that was the one he planned to operate under. Chad had read through the books of legislation he had found in Godric's Hollow and the ones he could buy out of bookshops, but they only covered the basics. Much like only listing the 10 Commandments instead of the book of the laws you needed to study to become a lawyer. Its main focus was on the International Confederation of Wizards' decision to enact the Statute of Secrecy in 1692 and the 3 unforgivable curses. Other than that was common-sense legislation like stealing, raping and murder. The full list of every law that was in effect under the Wisengamot could only be bought at the Ministry of Magic for 1,000 galleons. It was safe to say that not many people bought it other than old pure-blood families that planned to take full advantage of it. Worse, it was not even advertised. It had taken Chad a month to realize that his books on law were only primers and to track down the full list of legislation he wanted. The fact that all the Aurors he had Crystal ask in Diagon Alley had no clue what he was talking about was further proof of foul play. Technically, it was available for any that wanted to purchase it, but at such a high price and that it was so hard to find pointed to the fact that the higher-ups wanted the common rabble ignorant. That and the fact that there were no law wizards. If you broke the rules that you didn't know about, you were expected to defend yourself. There were allowances such as if you were underage, your guardian could take over the role, or if you gave up the right and had a Dumbledore on hand to fully take over your defense. You had to remember, the wizarding world was still stuck in the Dark Ages, things like fancy lawyers didn't exist, and ignorance was not an excuse. It was also why Muggleborns never achieved anything of worth. Oh, what's that new invention? A magical train set for children? I'm sorry, but you have just broken the misuse of Muggle artifacts laws, you will be heavily fined. A week later, the same toy is put on the shelf by a pure-blood after filling out the correct forms. Never mind the hypocrisy involved that has the train to Hogwarts magically enhanced, or that technically the law only prohibited the enchantment of a Muggle item with the intent to use it for purposes other than for what it was designed for. You're done, son. Chad had immediately bought the 1,000 galleon book and committed the whole thing to memory. The only redeeming quality about the price was that it was self-updating of any new laws. But boy was it worth the price. The most significant loophole that Chad had uncovered was the fact that magical contracts bypassed pretty much all laws. There was also practically none protecting Muggle rights, and Chad remembered that Muggle Protection Act was not proposed until 1992. God, he loved his eidetic memory. Everything from his old life was filed away and ready to access immediately, thanks to a clemency. He had a whole file on Harry Potter knowledge that was full of every wiki he ever read of information from the books. Some of it conflicted with actual facts uncovered in his new life, but the majority of it was valid and extremely valuable. Future knowledge was a massive cheat, up there with R.O.B. wishes. Muggles pretty much were deemed as beasts under wizard law, probably because they used to hunt and burn anything even suspected of being magical. The light wizards continually tried to get new protection acts through the Wisengamot, but their efforts were half-arsed at best. Even they were pretty biased against Muggles after all and looked down on them more than squibs that were disowned. The Weasleys were the best example of this. They were as light as could be, radically even, and still disowned Molly Weasley's second cousin. Ron assumed he was working as an accountant in the Muggle world and didn't even know his name. That coupled with bumbling Arthur Weasley, a staunch believer in the equality of all magical and Muggle folk, and knew absolutely nothing of them. That was why it was highly illegal to *PE a witch and then obliviate her, but the same act on a Muggle woman would only receive a rebuke without punishment. Tricking a witch into signing a magical contract agreeing to be a sex slave, however, was acceptable. You just needed to maintain her health and not blatantly torture or kill her, much like a magical creature. Then again, there was not really an agency for magical creature welfare, and house elves were a prime example of the breaches of the law concerning magical creatures. It was a very silly breach of basic freedom guaranteed by magical law, but so was pretty much all the acts still active. Even purebloods were not exempt from contract laws. If you were stupid enough to sign your rights away, you could be quickly relegated to the level of a magical creature, less so in some cases, and there was nothing the law could do about it. Sure, you would be scorned and ridiculed as a monster by the light side and some neutrals, but the dark would give you a high five and congratulate you for your savvy loophole use. Contracts with magically hidden words could be voided by the ministry if it was ever brought to their attention. Chad was amazed that more than half these laws had not been overturned in this day and age. Then again, after seeing the average intelligence of a magical human, it was pretty believable. He also suspected Dumbledore's hand in it, considering he was in charge of educating the new witches and wizards and at the head of two organizations that could bring everything to light for the public to rally behind. That and only the Minister of Magic had access to the Muggle government. Yeah, Chad was going to make use of the many loopholes to bring every witch and wizard under his control before they wizened up and destroyed the world. How the Muggles never rebelled after Voldemort's bullshit, Chad would never know. Surely there must have been plenty of it caught on surveillance cameras. The first thing he needed to do was write up a standard employment contract that would enslave stupid magical without them even knowing. Since a hit wizard trainee has a starting salary of 700 galleons per month, and these were the creme de la creme of the Aurors, then 100 galleons a week should be a very reasonable wage. Herbie pledge on my rights as a magical human that I will work for Mesopotamian Inc. for a term of 3 years. For the sum of 400 galleons a month, I agree to 48 hours of lawful work a week, 6 by 8-hour days, with an accrued 4 weeks a year of holiday pay. For this generous sum, I agree with the following rules and regulations and acknowledge that wages will not be paid if the contract is broken. Non-disclosure agreement covering employee identities and company operations, services, or building locations. No corporate espionage of any kind. No disrespect or violence towards Mesopotamian Inc. employees or owners. No derogatory comments or negative PR against Mesopotamian Inc. No blatant shirking of assigned work. Will not break any Ministry of Magic laws while employed by Mesopotamian Incorporated. If the signatory of this contract breaks these simple rules, they will use their own magic to apparate to the containment cells of Mesopotamian Inc. to await punishment under the laws of the Ministry of Magic. Employee underscore 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 date underscore 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 Mesopotamian Inc. representative underscore 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 Chad was pretty happy with the magical contract that he had written up to be used for standard recruitment. It was quite reasonable at first glance, but under a bit of scrutiny, it was filled with loopholes in his favor. Even the company name was a joke and a warning. Mesopotamia was one of the first civilizations to legalize slavery under the Code of Hammurabi. Pledging on their rights as a magical human would see them only having what little rights a Muggle had when they broke the contract. Non-disclosure agreement would leave them unable to talk about workmates, where they work or what they do. Hopefully, it would also magically protect against legitimacy. No disrespect or violence towards Mesopotamian Inc. employees or owners assumes that they are also under contract to respect you. A couple of people hired to annoy contract workers would see a few breaking the rules. No derogatory comments or negative PR against Mesopotamian Incorporated. Honestly, who hasn't complained about shit jobs or employers over a drink? No blatant shirking of assigned work. This and the 48 hours a week would wipe out a lot of people. Who hasn't had a bad day and knocked off early, took a long lunch or a cigarette break? Will not break any Ministry of Magic laws while employed by Mesopotamian Incorporated. Who even knows them all? There were no warnings or second chances. Break one of the rules of the contract, and you were magically forced to teleport to a containment room. This would be the first place an employee was shown after signing the contract, a comfortable but sparsely furnished cell with bars. That it had apparition and portkey wards to stop you leaving and a stunning ward for those arriving would not be mentioned. That and the ninja elves that would be transporting the new slaves to a secure location. The plan was a little convoluted, but it was also legal and above reproach. Sure, Chad could use legilimency to make everyone loyal, but where was the fun in that? Not to mention that on a large scale, it was not sustainable. There were roughly 20,000 people in magical Britain. To bring them all under control would need a method that his trusted minions could use without him. Chad sure as sh*t was not going to be teaching them mind magic, and any magical could empower a magical contract, even an elf. Since his elves would need a surname, Chad decided that all Peveril elves would have a last name of Domovoy. Domovoy, in Slavic mythology, was a household spirit and was loosely translated into a brownie for the English equivalent. It would be the ultimate F***CKU to wizards and witches to be sold into slavery by house elves. It sure had Boppy jumping around in excitement. Chad would need to recall a couple elves from Australia, but that would work out well. He could gain recruiters and receive a progress report on Australian operations since he had not heard from Crystal for a month or so. Funnily enough, Chad could find no laws that would make his plan illegal, even with using illusioned house elves as Mesopotamian representatives to witness and empower the contract. With another scheme that could not be traced back to him in the works, Chad had Boppy pop over to Crystal to get an update and bring back a couple ninjas for manpower. It took house elves a fair few jumps to reach the other side of the world, but funnily enough, only seemed to make them tired for a couple of hours. A round trip shouldn't take Boppy more than 8 hours to complete. Next on his list of things to do was to work out how to magically alter the human body. Just from the Harry Potter books, he already had examples of the following. It was possible to remove warts and blemishes, shrink, grow and straighten teeth, remove or regrow bones to different lengths, change hair length, use rituals to change/enhance/disfigure the body, heal open cuts and wounds with Dittany, burn healing paste to heal burns/damaged skin. Attempt to use the mending charm on flesh wounds can cause severe scarring but close injuries. Phoenix tears have immense healing powers. So with all this evidence, permanently changing the human body with magic was a thing. This was not even including metamorphmagy, animagus or polyjuice potions. But experimenting would have to wait until Boppy got back with more elves. Chad would also need him for researching, as the internet was not really up to the task yet in 1985. Maybe it was time for a nap. When Boppy returned with 5 elves, he had brought back a report that would make any master proud. Not only had land prices been ridiculously low in the countryside where he planned to set up his kingdom because it was basic farmland and bush, but Crystal had also somehow convinced the government to sell a lot of it in massive parcels of land. The fact that there were about 1,000 privately owned farms breaking up the property from being complete was a minor matter. A week of legilimency and organizing all the farmers to meet up in one convenient place to discuss buying their land with cash, and it would be solved quickly. Since he already owned the deed to some land, the elves took that as a sign to develop a vast underground complex as a future home/storage place. Literal tons of gold and piles of uncut diamonds were stored away by his eager little followers. Thanks to their short mining education, they had even taken other valuable gems and rare minerals that were found while hunting for their primary targets. The only problem was that it was late 1985 and prices were but a fraction of what they would be worth after 2015. Still, Chad was planning to store it all away for his rainy day fund, and with the elves mining everything they could find, prices were bound to inflate with nothing being introduced into the market. Africa was next on the list after Chad was satisfied that the elves had taken the valuable and easily mined gems and minerals. It would be even cheaper to buy up massive tracts of land in Africa. The only problem was the public safety of any company he built there. But that could also kill 2 birds with 1 stone. He could recruit from the local population, brainwash them, train and equip them, and then have them secure the area while recruiting more. But that was for later. After Boppy returned and was praised for the excellent work of his elves, he was to pop Chad around to different universities and hospitals. This was so Chad could pillage every bit of medical knowledge that the best and brightest of the UK had to offer. He didn't even have to meet them, merely appear disillusioned in front of them, make eye contact, and copy their minds. Chad could have been gentle and scanned only for relevant information, but that would have taken a lot longer. Instead, he did what he did to Voldemort. Since the Muggles had no defenses, he invaded their minds, forced his will over theirs and turned the representation of their soul/mind into a holodisk. Chad then made a copy and released his hold over the original, letting it return to normal. This had the side effect of giving them a chronic migraine, but with no lasting side effects other than head-splitting pain for 10 minutes while their mind healed from the brute force attack. Not only was it quicker, but it was also way more extensive and captured every memory the victim had. Afterwards was spent hunting down all relevant medical books and reading/scanning them into his memories. It was very time-consuming, and coupled with filtering the memories from well-renowned doctors and surgeons in all fields, it would keep him very busy for the next year or so. Chad knew it was one thing to copy knowledge, and quite another to make it yours, but this was a subject that needed intimate knowledge. He was going to be changing the human body with magic, and any tiny error could have fatal side effects. Bubbles of air in the circulating blood can cause death or brain damage. Who knows what losing focus while using magic to alter the body would cause. While Chad was mastering medicine, Crystal spent every bit of cash that the elves had pillaged from around the world during the house elf recruitment. Before Crystal had returned to England, she had traveled to Switzerland to open a bank account and then dump all the different currencies into it. With the Swiss banking secrecy laws at the time, this was the safest way to launder money and made it a lot easier to buy land in Australia. But now she had spent it all and needed more money to fulfill her little master's schemes. Luckily, House Elves recruitment was ready for Phase 2, and another magical world tour was called for. This time she would be offering 600 galleons for a House Elf. Crystal had taken 200 ninja elves and had started touring every country with a magical town to recruit elves once again, as it had been over 6 months since her last recruitment drive. Chad had made sure that rumors of her forcing elves to wear clothes only for them to run away and similar stories had been spread around. That was why she was recruiting again. She needed more to free. With the extra 100 galleon added to the price, too many desperate or greedy folk thought it was the best time to sell. 2 months later, Crystal had bought 524 more elves to join the noble and most ancient house of Peveril. As soon as they were purchased, a ninja elf would pop them to the Godric's Hollow base for Boppy to induct into the ranks as either a ninja, chef, gardener, or a miner. Even though there was a lot of crossover with the professions, they were explicitly trained in their chosen profession. And since the ninja and chef elves got special weapons, Chad had to commission elf-sized enchanted pickaxes and garden spades for the 2 new professions. The over £2 million price for the elves and their new equipment was but a drop of water in a pond compared to funds the ninjas raked in from pillaging. It seems that after being hit, the gangs had either folded and were overrun by new gangs taking over territory or had taken out loans from shady people to recoup losses. Either way, Chad had profited from their business acumen as they seemed to bounce right back when left with drugs to continue to sell. Or maybe it was just the insane amount of profit the drug business turned over. The thought of selling the guns back to the gangs crossed Chad's mind, but in the end, he decided to keep them to arm his minions in Africa when he started that project. With 130 new dedicated miners, Chad recalled 200 more ninjas and had the now 400-strong ninja team start roaming every city to loot instead of those just housing magical towns. The Godric's Hollow base had been expanded to account for all the new jewelry and weapons, but the sheer scale of loot gathered had needed another storage facility to be built. Thinking of minions, Crystal was beginning to get a bit haggard with the amount of strain she was under juggling so many jobs, so he might as well gather some lackeys for her. He thought of the new Muggleborn recruits that had started flooding in once his ninjas disguised as wizards started offering good money for full-time employment. But they were too corrupted by magical stupidity to help run a company. Chad wanted beautiful women to help with the face of his company, but with enough smarts to help out instead of hinder Crystal. It was then he had an idea that would take care of recruiting but would also bring some media attention to Elfin Incorporated. There was a British tabloid newspaper called The Sun that was well known for publishing an image of a topless woman on the 3rd page. They were known as Page 3 Girls and could solve his problems with finding beautiful women to help manage his company. A quick scan of their minds to make sure they were up for the task, and then he could send over Crystal for an interview if they were interested. He could just brainwash them into working for him, but Chad liked to think he was above just kidnapping innocent Muggle women. That's not to say he won't be enforcing loyalty if they signed on. He would save his darker side for criminals, enemies, and magical retards that could not be left to wander around like a time bomb. It was inevitable that after the year 2000, a stupid wizard or witch was going to do something foolish and out the whole community. Chad was under no illusion that he was a good person. In fact, as much as he heaped scorn on Dark Lord Dumbledore, he was pretty similar in morality. But even he liked to draw the line somewhere. After putting Boppy on the job of collecting issues of this year's Sun newspaper, he got back to studying medicine and how magic could affect it. Soon he would start experimenting with criminal volunteers that his ninjas would find, but he didn't want to end up going all mad scientist and exploding test subjects if he could help it. He would be starting with cosmetic surgery and then moving to more invasive experiments like muscle growth. Medicine really was a fascinating subject, but even after months of study and assimilating all the knowledge he had stolen from experts, he was still nervous about applying it to a live human. A week had passed, and Chad was now hovering over a sedated but still restrained murderous gangbanger. He had just sent off a list of page 3 girls for the lovely Miss Clear to select any that she liked, as they all seemed to be capable, and was now ready for science. Well, magical science. He started with the teeth, focusing his mind with a clemency and commanding them to change with his reality-bending powers. Sure enough, the hideous yellow and crooked chompers gradually turned into perfect white teeth that a dentist would be proud to own. Surely it couldn't be that easy. Chad just used his knowledge of how teeth were formed and what they were made of, then exercised his will over them to perform an operation that would have cost thousands of pounds. Well, that's a tick in the win column, Chad thought to himself. He hoped all magic was as easy as that. Other than training his telekinesis, of which he was up to 4 separate objects at the same time, this was really the first time that he had purposely used magic. Next was to fix up the munt piece of flesh this guy used as a face. It had acne scars, real scars from what looked like a knife, and his features just were not natural looking. His eyes were too wide apart, and he had a weak chin and a bulbous nose. No wonder he went into a life of crime, he had probably never had a willing sexual partner. But Dr. Chad is in the house. Ready to fix your cosmetic needs, he said in a sing-song voice. Mustering his willpower, Chad set about correcting the cosmetic disaster of a face. With his thorough understanding of how everything fits together, was made of, and what needed to be changed, it only took him 30 minutes to finish the magical operation. He turned someone that fell from the top of an ugly tree, hitting every branch on the way down with his face, into a pretty boy. The hardest part had been fixing the fish eyes, but slow and steady bone manipulation and not having to change anything structural had made the procedure straightforward. It was official, Chad was a god. Flush with success, he started working on expanding the thug's arm muscles. If he could turn a wimp into a Captain America, his minions would be unstoppable. Experimental Thug A's bicep started to expand, and his arm gained a third of its size in seconds. Unfortunately, that was when his skin burst and a jet of blood hit Chad in the face. The unexpected surprise caused his focused willpower to lapse with disastrous results. The muscles Chad was developing abruptly increased manyfold and looked like a Bandersnatch zombie out of Resident Evil. With veins and skin exploding from the sudden explosion of tissue growth, blood was leaking out as if it was severed. 3 hours later, an experimental Thug A had died from blood loss. Not from the first failed attempt at increasing the mass of arm muscles, he had managed to cut off the supply of blood and repair the arm. No, he had died after the 5th attempt of increasing muscle mass, this time on his left thigh. There were just too many things to concentrate on at the same time when artificially growing muscles with magic. He had achieved the desired result when he took things exceptionally slowly, gradually working everything at the same time. But this was after witnessing the damage in certain areas from unexpected size increase and continuously having to repair tearing and all sorts of problems created from expanding flesh. Chad was calling hacks on metamorphmagus abilities. It was possible that he was overthinking things and limiting his magic with his scientific approach. But if potions could rapidly increase or decrease muscle mass, then Chad's magic should also be able to. Looking at the pale corpse, he focused his will and commanded the body to be a buff He-Man. And just like that, the corpse now looked like a bodybuilder. Looking over at experimental Thug B strapped to a nearby table, he focused his will again and repeated the exact same action. Experimental Thug B exploded in a shower of blood and gore, causing Chad to puke his guts up in reflex from disgust. Steadying himself, he mentally commanded experimental Thug B to be repaired and not all over the walls, floor, and ceiling. A second later, another buff corpse was laying on the table. Why was an alive human harder to change than a lifeless body? It was possible to transform a human into a rock, why was it so hard to give him muscles? It couldn't be about willpower, Chad was significantly stronger than an undefended muggle, and forcing a man into the shape of a rock disproved that. Could the soul be interfering? Walking over to experimental Thug C, Chad entered his mind and captured his soul, dragging it back into his own mindscape. The pressure of holding onto a full soul, even a muggle one, was a lot more than pieces of Voldemort's broken soul. Once again, Chad commanded the same action on the still alive but soulless body of experimental Thug C. This time, the results were what Chad had been trying to achieve. Returning Thug C's soul and strengthening the restraints, Chad inspected every inch of the now muscular body of perfection. There was no tearing or damage, and from every test he performed, either magical or mundane, Thug C was now He-Man. Chad cursed in frustration, experimental Thug T had just died. After his initial breakthrough with experimental Thug C, Chad had been intoxicated with his success and started making grand plans for his security firm. Even more so when he had experimental Thug C wake up and test his new strength. But after 2 days of testing, Thug C had started becoming more and more lethargic until he died in his sleep on the 5th night after his magical surgery. 3 more test thugs later, and Chad had narrowed down the cause of death to when he removed the soul, somehow breaking its anchor to the body. The only reason it had lasted for 5 days happened because it was the original body and was mostly compatible, even with all the changes. This was disastrous for his new plans, and he had tried to fix the soul anchor problem at the cost of violent criminals' lives. But all was not lost. With each grisly death, he was one step closer to obtaining mastery over the human body with magic. While he was testing the strength of the connection of the soul to the body, he had resumed his previous experiments with muscle growth and cosmetic surgery. He could now almost effortlessly change anything that a plastic surgeon could, from facelifts to liposuction. He was able to grow perfectly shaped fun bags on a man that felt and acted like the real thing and was confident it would be even more manageable on a woman. Luckily, or unluckily as the case may be, those thugs with now massive breasts had died, protecting the world from macho men with D-cups and saving Chad the effort of changing them back. Not that it would take much effort, it merely weirded him out playing with a man's lady boobs. Still, 20 thugs later and he was no closer to a Captain America magic fix. He could buff out any limb after an hour's concentration and constant repairs, but then it would be incompatible with the rest of the body and need him to upgrade that, which then led to the next problem. Sure, eventually, he would be able to achieve a desirable outcome. However, it would take many hours of magical surgery and still be riddled with issues like flexibility or straining joints and muscles. Chad's morality was sorely tested, as he had nearly just said, F***ck it, and tracked down Nymphadora Tonks to devour her soul for the answers. The Blacks had created a masterpiece in the form of the Metamorphmagus. Maybe there would be some records of their experiments with the soul in their vast, dark library. If only that idiot Sirius had not run off to chase the rat, but Chad heavily suspected Dumbledore's hand in that. How convenient that it played out almost exactly the same as before with the same amount of Muggle casualties. The only difference was that now an even more battered rodent would turn up at the Weasleys' house. Chad wondered if Percy would still accept a pet rat that was missing an eye, a whole foot and a toe off another. He laughed at the thought of all those naive fools that thought Dumbledore didn't know Sirius Black was innocent. Dumbledore knew when to send Hagrid, the groundskeeper that can't teleport or use magic, but also refused to go himself. He must have been doing more important things than investigating the death of his Order of Phoenix members and Voldemort. But wait. There was a prophecy that was the reason they were hiding in the first place. What a coincidence. Hagrid then rocked up on Sirius's bike when he handed over baby Harry. If Sirius was a Death Eater, then why would he give a filthy half-breed his most prized possession and his godson? At the very least, it warranted a trial. Especially when Sirius was a well-renowned hit wizard and Order of the Phoenix member who had even traded blows with Voldemort's inner circle. Plus, you know, the whole mind-reading thing that Dumbledore had been using on his students. Yeah, much more likely the cowardly guy with the rat Animagus is innocent, not the loyal dog Animagus. And yes, of course, Dumbledore knew they were all Animagus. You think he would let his pet werewolf run around unsupervised? It was also no surprise to Chad that Dumbles would kill off Muggles to frame an innocent man. After all, the Dark Lord hated Muggles for destroying his family. At the age of 6, Ariana, Albus's sister, was assaulted by 3 Muggle boys. The incident left her permanently traumatized and unable to control her magic powers. Percival, his dad, attacked her assailants in a fit of vengeful rage. This resulted in his arrest and conviction by the Ministry of Magic to be later sentenced to Azkaban where he died. After his mother also died, Albus was resentful when he had to take responsibility for Ariana after the death of both their parents, which forced him to stay at home and abandon his ambitious plans. The great Albus Dumbledore then fostered a romantic relationship with Dark Lord in training Gellert Grindelwald. They had both planned to lead a wizarding revolution to end the International Statute of Secrecy and create a benevolent global hierarchical order led by wise and powerful witches and wizards that dominated Muggles. When Aberforth, Albus's brother, found out what the crazy bastards were up to, he ended up in a 3-way duel with them that led to one of them killing Ariana. How someone so traumatized by Muggles that she could not control her magic suddenly found the courage to jump into a 3-way magic fight still baffled Chad. Anyway, after killing his sister with a killing curse, you know he did, Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore suddenly renounced his evil ways and became the leader of the light. More likely, the evil bastard used the Imperious Curse to make his sister jump into the fight so he could be free of her and reinvent his image as a good guy. He already knew Grindelwald's plans and knew they would never work, so he went the other route of claiming magical Britain as his own and using proxies to kill Muggles. But this was all speculation. What mattered was he needed to get into the ancestral home of the Black family to read their books. Since Sirius had once again ended up in Azkaban, and Chad was pretty sure he was yet to make Harry Potter his heir, that left only one option. Kreacher. It was now 1986, and Chad had confirmed months ago that Walburga Black had died thanks to the massive Daily Prophet newspaper announcement. He had not acted on it yet because he didn't want to deal with an unstable creature, and he was busy playing God with his experiments. When the Dursleys had gone to bed, Chad had Boppy teleport him over to an empty park on the outskirts of London. Hopefully, it was remote enough that any use of magic would go unnoticed. With his team of ninjas securing the perimeter, there was practically zero chance of being seen by curious muggles. They would also serve as protection from the mentally unstable creature if he decided to get physical, the slave magic making him unable to use magic unless in defense of his master. With Boppy by his side decked out in his butler uniform and pimp cane, Chad was ready to try and summon him. Gathering his will, he called for the most sinister and haggard-looking house elf in the Potterverse. Kreacher. After waiting for a couple minutes with no result, Chad once again called out. Kreacher. With a pop, a hunched-over elf in dirty rags appeared. Instead of innocent and large bulbous eyes like a normal house elf, Kreachers were squinty and measuring. With a surprising command over the English language, Kreacher spoke with a gravelly voice. Who are you, wizard child? Well, that depends on you, Kreacher. I am either going to be your new master or someone that can do you a favor in return for access to 12 Grimmauld Place and its library. It is entirely up to you which one, replied Chad. You want to be my master? You are probably just a filthy mudblood trying to steal my lady's things, said Kreacher hatefully. Nearly, my father was a pure blood, but my mother was a mudblood. I hardly see why that would matter. The idiot Sirius is my godfather, and I will own Grimmauld Place eventually unless he has children. Oh, it's even worse. A half-blood and heir of the blood traitor. You will never step foot in the house as long as I live. The little bugger was working himself up into a racist frenzy. Really? Not even if I can destroy the locket that Regulus asked you to? I have already broken one of Voldemort's Horcruxes, another will be child's play, said Chad, forgetting that he was technically a child. Kreacher's creepy stare increased tenfold, and he became absolutely still at that little nugget of information. It was the one thing that drove him to keep on living after all his masters had died, Regulus's final request. Not to mention that no one knew of it. You can, he practically whispered in his hoarse little voice. Easily, Chad confirmed. With a gesture to Boppy, his head minion slowly twisted the head of his pimp cane and pulled out the hidden blade in a non-threatening way. Did I mention that all house elves that serve me loyally receive a weapon? Kreacher's squinty eyes nearly popped out of his head when he saw Boppy's shiny 18-inch enchanted blade. His surprised face then morphed into one of envy, then thoughtful and finally a decidedly bloodthirsty smile. Maybe a half-blood master is okay, but only if you can destroy the locket. With a pop, Kreacher returned holding a locket with so much gold and bling that a rapper would give his left nut to own it. Chad had long prepared to absorb the Horcruxes and had studied all the curses on them from Riddle's memories. With an almost negligent wave, the curse that had been trying, and failing, to influence his mind disappeared. With a nod to Boppy to protect him while he prepared to absorb Voldemort's soul piece, he began. Just like the ring, he broke the locket's anchor and then used his magic to pull the ghastly face that appeared into his mindscape. When he was experimenting with thugs A through T, he had noticed the mental pressure of just holding a full Muggle soul and had not tried to absorb any because of it. Chad had seen the cost of disrupting the anchor of a soul to its body and was not about to consume a full Muggle soul with unknown side effects. It wasn't even magical. There was a genuine chance that he might turn himself into a squib, destroy his own soul anchor or explode his body like the unfortunate experimental thugs when he overwhelmed their bodies with his magic. Chad planned to tread very carefully where his own soul was concerned. He was still a bit leery after playing with the 20 gangsters' souls and seeing the consequences. He had waited 3 months before he ate the second piece of Voldemort's soul, giving his body and soul time to adjust instead of overwhelming it with a foreign new power. But just like the first, all it did was strengthen his mental strength and soul. Since 2 little, formatted, pieces of broken soul had only empowered his own willpower and made magic even more accessible with no side effects, Chad would once again take another bite of tasty wizard soul. If there was any discomfort or soul leakage from absorbing too much, then he would stop at once and take emergency measures that he was unwilling to try unless in a life-threatening situation. Appearing on the outskirts of the post-apocalyptic town that was his mindscape, he was once again confronted with Riddle's shade. Since the first soul piece he absorbed was the latest and most knowledgeable of the Horcruxes, there was no need for its memories, only its power. Chad had already taunted one shade with its failure, this time he decided to switch things up for sh*ts and giggles. At last, I have found you, my lord. Chad said, kneeling down on one knee and internally laughing at Riddle's smug smile at his submission. For 500 years we've been searching for you, god of muggles and savior of those without the vile taint of magic. The evil god Dumbledore and his magically corrupted mudblood followers have tried to enslave us, the only real humans, not that demonic trash in human form. I have volunteered to undergo a ritual that sacrificed 10 mudblood scum to gain their taint so you could use my body and finish what you started all those years ago, the death and destruction of all things magical. Chad shouted passionately, entirely playing the part of a fanatic. Looking at Voldemort's "the-fuck" face, it seems his random speech announcing him as the champion of muggles had disturbed him completely. Chad didn't even know a mental representation could fade with just verbal attacks, as Riddle's shade had lost a significant amount of substance from his ethereal form. Voldemort was looking physically sick at the news of being revered as the savior of muggles and the destroyer of all things magical, a mean feat considering he was incorporeal. Standing up, Chad dealt the finishing blow. Come, my lord, take my body. From the ancient texts left behind by your muggle knights, the Death Eaters, we have prepared 10 innocent and pure virginal muggle boys for you to recharge your holy power. Riddle became even less tangible at the thought of his precious Knights of Walpurgis being muggle and that the world thought he needed young boys to recharge his magic. The little bit of resolution he had left shattered like glass. Interesting, without strong conviction and determination, the mental representation of the soul lost most of its power. It's obvious now that I think of it, a weak will is much easier to crush than a strong one. A psychological blow is just as deadly as attacking his shade with mentally created guardians. Chad thought to himself, mind magic was so versatile. After that reflection, Chad didn't even bother using some of his new defenses. Enjoying the defeated expression of the egomaniac Voldemort after he had just been earnestly informed that all of his aspirations had been twisted into the very thing he despised, he exercised his will. With a pop, another Voldemort holodisc fell to the ground. How disappointing, Chad said to the now empty mindscape, besides his mindscape guardians of course. He wanted a challenge to see how his new synthetic humanoids would perform after being hit with a killing curse. Teleporting to his quarantined computer to format the new holodisc of all its tainted emotion and memories, he was suddenly struck by a revelation about the light side's argument of dark magic being addictive and turning you dark. Curses that needed to be powered by negative thoughts and emotion would, after frequent and unrestricted use, align your willpower to negative emotions. But this would only happen if you were a weak-willed retard that had no mental discipline and relied entirely on a wand. Holy schizophrenia, Batman. That just described 98% of magicals. Even the very few that practiced a clemency only used it to defend their mind and put up a cold mask, not master their emotions with it. Could it be that simple? Voldemort was an exception because there was a genuine possibility that he was mind-raped by Dumbledore, and then he tore his soul into 5 pieces. Voldemort was doomed from the start, but even then he still had more willpower than most. After handicapping himself, he was still able to use basic wandless magic, a feat thought impossible by the majority of wizard kind. Chad will have to keep an eye on his new wizard minions if they start using dark magic. Inserting the holodisc into the old Vault-Tec computer, Chad wiped the soul disc clean and then ejected it out. Another flex of his will and it became an easily swallowable pill-shaped soul. Just like the 2 times before he ate a piece of soul, Chad immediately felt the effects. The physical representation of his willpower glowed with golden light, and he became flush with power. Chad completely understood He-Man's need to shout it out every time. Unlike the other 2 times, he felt the beginnings of mental pressure over the surge of energy flowing into him. It was not very noticeable, and he would have completely missed it if he was not scanning himself for any conflicting issues. Maybe it also happened before, and he just missed it because he was experiencing a power high. Leaving his mindscape, he was greeted by an anxious creature even though only seconds had passed while he had been trolling and then consuming Voldemort's soul. Utilizing his magic to scan the now soul-free locket, it came back clear of any spell or enchantment. Just a very ostentatious piece of jewelry of a famous wizard, Chad at least expected it to hold some unique magic like Helga's cup. Since it had no value other than a collector's item, Chad gave it to creature to gain loyalty points. When the little wrinkly ballsack-looking elf took the locket in his trembling miniature hands and had tears leaking out his squinty, calculating eyes, Chad knew he had won the vicious dark elf over. Congratulations, creature, your master's final order has been fulfilled. Chad waited while the little bugger dealt with his emotions that had been eating away at his psyche for the last 5 years. After a few minutes, the old elf straightened himself as much as his hunched back allowed, wiped his eyes, reached out to grab Chad's hand and completed the elf bond. This was better than he had expected. He thought that the standoffish house elf raised on dark magic would only let him use the Black Library in payment. Hell, Chad even suspected the cunning midget might leg it after he had seen the locket destroyed. In the books, Chad found Creature way more entertaining than Dobby and his near-fatal protection. The creepy little racist firing off slurs at Hermione as she fought for his elf rights was absolutely hilarious. But just like the other 2 scenarios, Chad had a plan for this one. Since Boppy is my head elf of the noble and most ancient house of Peveril, I'm going to need a head elf for when I inherit the noble and most ancient house of Black. What do you think, Creature? The wrinkly skin on his face was flapping around as he shook his head rapidly in the affirmative. Yes, Master. I will serve you faithfully until I die. Excellent, having such a clever head elf overseeing House Black would put me at ease. Since you are now my head elf, you will need house elves to order around, otherwise, you are just a normal house elf. But that can be arranged later. Explained Chad. Seeing the old house elf absorbing what he had just been told but still nodding his head in agreement, he continued on, now, I know as a loyal elf of House Black you do things differently, and that's okay, but now you represent me. See Boppy here? That's his uniform as head elf, he wears that while he serves me. But when he is off duty, he is free to wear whatever he likes. For example, what you are wearing now is you off-duty attire, but when you are representing House Black, you will be in your uniform. This took a bit more time before the old elf finally nodded his head in acceptance at the foreign concept of a uniform. House elves are so intensely loyal to their masters that they will not allow themselves to be set free unless their master presents them with clothes. To symbolize this, they usually wear makeshift clothes made with found objects such as pillowcases and rags. These clothes can become quite filthy, and yet the house elf will not clean their clothes to express further that they have no needs which are not explicitly commanded to them by the master. Chad found the idea of being surrounded by dirty beggar-like elves distasteful, especially when they were preparing his food. It was now time for an incentive and to galvanize Creature's loyalty to his new master. Now, as you can see, Boppy has a cane as a symbol of his loyalty and status. Dippy. With a pop, a fully clad ninja elf appeared kneeling in front of Chad. Show, Creature your blade please. The little ninja stood and faced Creature while he silently drew his elf-sized sword. Creature's now wide-open eyes were shimmering with barely controlled desire. Dippy resheathed his blade and then stalked over to stand beside Boppy. Chefs have an enchanted knife, miners an enchanted pickaxe and gardeners an enchanted spade. Since Boppy is head elf of House Peveril, he needed a symbol fitting of his station. You are the head elf of House Black, what do you want for your symbol? As the ancient elf danced around in excitement, and was surprisingly spry for his age, at the thought of receiving something designed to maim and kill, Chad wondered if he should have just made another pimp cane. Well, too late now. I hope the little wannabe murder hobo doesn't ask for a scythe. Chad thought to himself as he watched the elf finally calm down. So Creature, you don't have to decide yet. Please do some research first on suitable weapons that could be disguised in a symbol of your station as head elf, then let me know. In the meantime, do you think it is possible to enter Grimmauld Place now? Of course, Master. Though I will have to lower the defenses to let you in. Explained House Black's head elf. A few seconds later and they were standing outside 12 Grimmauld Place, waiting for Creature to give them the all-clear. A common misconception about the ancestral Black family home was that it had always been under the Fidelius charm. It did, however, have a muggle-repelling charm like the leaky cauldron, which confused the mailman when the house numbers went from 11 to 13. If it was under a Fidelius charm, then Narcissa Malfoy, née Black, would have been able to crash the Order of the Phoenix meetings. Otherwise, they would have had to dispel the immensely complex spell, while hiding a house from the neighbors that suddenly appeared out of nowhere, and then recast it with Dumbledore as the keeper. No, the reason that the house stood untouched was because it had ridiculously offensive protective wards that activated upon Walburga's death. The house then passed to her only living descendant, Sirius, who had been blasted off the family tree but had apparently not been disinherited. So when Narcissa rocked up to claim the place as a branch member of the Black family, the protective wards did not respond as she wasn't the master. The kicker was that Creature was keyed into the wards, and while he could not transfer the authorization to anyone, he could let people through them. If only the wizard kind did not have such a hate boner for elves. The door of 12 Grimmauld Place opened and Creature and gave Chad a formal bow, his arms sweeping out in a flourish to welcome him inside. Not 10 paces past the foyer and they were greeted with Sirius's mother, Walburga Black's portrait. The books did her a disservice by implying she was an ugly, evil old witch. Sure, she was as old as dirt, but she would have been a looker back in her prime. Would have to be to draw the attention of her second cousin, Orion Black. Then again, a lot of rednecks marry their cousins and not out of lust. Well, lust for their beauty. I see we have guests. Introduce us, Creature, said the severe old woman as she gazed at Creature, leading the odd group. It consisted of Chad, Boppy and Dippy the ninja. The other ninjas were waiting outside. She was wearing a black headscarf, making her look like she had recently come from a funeral, and her tone of voice was cold and not at all welcoming. Mistress, this is... It was at this point that Creature realized that he didn't know his master's name, other than he was of House Peveril. Recognizing that he never actually introduced himself to his new head elf, Chad jumped in when he saw Creature faltering under the withering stare of his old mistress. Allow me to introduce myself, Mrs. Black. My name is Harrison Chad Peveril. But please, call me Chad. I see. Peveril is an old pure-blood family name that died out. I believe the descendants now go by Potter, correct? Chad gave her a smile and a nod to acknowledge her reasoning. And if I'm not mistaken, then you must be the son of that blood traitor that married that filthy mudblood whore. Creature, how dare you defile this house by letting this child of filth into? Chad watched Creature's reaction as Walburga ranted and raved like a lunatic, which to be fair, she was. But then again, Chad had yet to meet a woman that wasn't crazy, merely those that hid it better. The poor elf was trapped between his old mistress and the new master that promised to give him a weapon. It was time to put this frothing B***TCH in her place. Concentrating on gathering his will, Chad visualized releasing an aura of dominance and then projected it out. Boppy and Dippy immediately kneeled in reverence, while Creature's head whipped around to stare at Chad with mouth gaping open, before quickly joining the other elves in paying obeisance to their master. Walburga Black had gone silent as even as a mere soul imprint that was enchanted into a portrait could feel the power rolling off Chad in waves. The fact that he was only 6 years old only added to why Mrs. Black was currently gaping like a fish out of water. Chad directed it mostly at her after Creature was reminded of who he now served. Seeing the opulent salon that made up the background of Walburga's portrait slowly turning black, as Chad's power ate away at its enchantments, had her shaking with fear. Cutting off his magic after seeing her suitably cowered, Chad then tried again to get a reasonable conversation out of her. Now, let's try that again, shall we? You are correct when you guessed that I am the son of James and Lily Potter, and yes, Lily Potter was a mudblood. I also did indeed change my name to something more befitting a dignified wizard than what my parents gave me. But I don't see why that is a reason to be King B***TCH. Chad said in a cold, yet conversational tone before screaming the last two words infused with his power. Looking at the submissive old lady slumped in her chair instead of the perfect example of a pure-blooded noble from before, he would say she was appropriately made aware of who was in charge. Everyone can scream and act like a child, Mrs. Black. Frankly, I expected better from someone with your breeding and station. To see what has become of the all-powerful noble and most ancient House of Black, indeed shows how far the wizarding world has fallen. This cutting remark from a child was really kicking the crazy old B***TCH while she was down. You are free to believe in blood purity and its mistaken belief that pure bloods are magically superior to half-bloods or mudbloods. Hell, I even find it funny that some of the pure bloods claim that mudbloods are stealing their magic. Wouldn't that suggest that they are actually stronger than pure bloods when they can easily take your magic without trying? That makes pure bloods sound weak and pathetic, afraid and lashing out at the lowly mudbloods. Are you scared of mudbloods, Mrs. Black? Chad asked, his eyes piercing Walburga Black's counterfeit soul. No. She managed to stutter out, her fear of Chad had not diminished even though he was back to speaking in soft tones. Good. It would not do to have the once matriarch of a noble and most ancient house afraid of muggleborns. I mean, the laws are so stacked against them that there is not even a need to outright attack them like that half-blood Voldemort. You are only giving them an excuse to gain more rights, freedom and power. Not a smart move to give the peasants a reason to rebel. Half-Bodhi! Shouted Mrs. Black, her discriminatory tendencies finally winning over her fear. You weren't aware? Of course, you wouldn't be. There would be no way that someone with you views on blood supremacy would follow and enslave your child to a man with a muggle father. He answered condescendingly. Muggle? Wait, what do you mean enslave? The painting's eyes abruptly filled with horror at the implication that she had sold her sweet Regulus to a half-blood. With but a thought and a wave of his hand, Chad replicated what Riddle had done in the Chamber of Secrets. Unlike that chump, who had to use a wand to write it, Chad made the words appear with his mind like a boss. "I am Lord Voldemort" suddenly became visible and then morphed into Tom Marvolo Riddle, much to the horror of Mrs. Black. Riddle was not a noble name. Did you honestly think the dark mark that the Death Eaters displayed with pride was just a magically induced brand that allowed Riddle to summon his pure-blood minions? Shaking his head, Chad was genuinely surprised at how the purebloods had remained in control when a mind-raped patsy like Voldemort could have them dancing like monkeys. And that didn't even enter the half-blood Dumbledore into the equation. Mrs. Black had just had her world rocked, and Chad gave the portrait a cruel smile that promised more emotion torment. Do you know what the best part of all of this, Mrs. Black? Voldemort was nothing but a cat's paw, a patsy, a dupe, a chump, an instrument, a stooge, nothing but a tool for another half-blood. Can you guess who was pulling the strings? The one behind the curtain making all you superior pure-blooded nobles prance around like puppets? Asked Chad. Each new word was spoken with malice and designed to cause the crazy old blood supremacist emotion pain. By the way the color drained from the painting's face, and how she fainted in a heap on the floor of her portrait, it seems that even though she was insane, Mrs. Black was not stupid and had made the connection to Dumbledore. Chad hated being disrespected, especially now that he had reality warping abilities. His magical prowess had only inflated his already massive ego, and the old adage of power corrupting was undoubtedly applicable here. When Mrs. Black had ranted at him about his mother being a mudblood and by extension making Chad filth, the actual insult did not bother him. But he hated that she had treated him with contempt. That **King painting of an old, incestual tramp, who ruined her own family with her stupidity, actually looked down on him. Chad didn't have to be so cruel with his verbal thrashing of everything Walburga Black held dear. However, that bitch had disrespected him, and Chad was petty enough to emotionally butcher her for his own amusement and give the knife an extra twist. Looking at Mrs. Black passed out in her painting, Chad felt the satisfying feeling of retribution at the emotional suffering he inflicted on her for her disrespect. Maybe I should write out an evil overlords list just in case I start to follow the villain cliché and start doing stupid **T to satisfy my ego. Chad thought to himself, noticing his own character flaws becoming more extreme. He then turned his attention to the three kneeling house elves that were staring at him with reverence. Kreacher's eyes were wide open once again and held the same amount of devotion that could only be found in religious fanatics. It seems that witnessing him destroy Kreacher's old mistress effortlessly, and the power he displayed, had solidified Chad's position as his new master. Thus was born the Alpha Master. Rise, my elves. Kreacher, perhaps you could lead us to the library now since Mrs. Black is currently indisposed. Chad said in a bored tone while giving Mrs. Black's portrait a dismissive look. Of course, Master. It will be my pleasure. Chad swore that the old elf had somehow de-aged by 50 years with how he was acting, even his face seemed to have fewer wrinkles on it. Although Mrs. Black had only died a few months ago, the house looked like it had not been occupied for years. It was not as dilapidated as described in canon when Harry Potter first stepped foot in it, but a pureblood would have been ashamed to be caught residing in it. It seems Mrs. Black had lost all desire to live when her favorite son had died. It was pretty cold-blooded of her to not even help Sirius out of a blatant setup, but then again maybe she was finally proud of him, thinking he had become dark. It was also pretty surprising that the nobles had allowed his sentencing to Azkaban without even a court appearance. Even if all the dark families knew he was innocent and wanted revenge, to set a precedent for jailing nobles without a trial was retarded. Then again, Chad should really stop being surprised at the stupid shite wizardkind do. He once again made a note of checking himself for similar flaws. Maybe have one of his new wizard slaves stand behind him and whisper, "Remember, you are mortal," like the ancient Romans used to. Kreacher led them through the dusty halls and down a flight of steps before they arrived in a room comfortably housing 1,000 magic-related books. Smiling in anticipation at hopefully finding a couple books on soul magic, Chad was also happy to now have some books on wizardry that were not dumbed down by ministry bullshit laws. Reaching out with his magic to encompass the bookshelves, he felt a few react when sensing for a magical signature. 10 minutes later and over 100 books were isolated using his telekinesis for suspected harmful curses. Unfortunately, after having his house elf scan through the books left, none of them covered soul magic. One book comprised the glorious history of the Black's mastery over soul magic and the creation of the first ever metamorphmagus, but all records and notes were destroyed in fear of another family replicating their achievements. An understandable reaction, but nonetheless stupid. Without any reference material, there would not be any further accomplishments in the subject, and if it was passed on by word of mouth, then it has obviously been lost. Sirius, the last living member of the mainline, left home at the age of 16 and was later jailed at age 22. Any dark magic he knew would be on the level of harmful schoolyard prank spells. Left with no choice but to brave the cursed books, Chad once again used telekinesis to sort the books, so he did not inadvertently curse himself by touching them. A couple had tried to corrupt his magic as they were lifted, but it was a weak attempt that was quickly crushed. The closest he came to something usable was a tome on Horcruxes, but Chad already had memories of Voldemort reading the same book. In frustration, he flooded the tome with his magic and inadvertently burnt out the curse. The only problem with that was the brute strength destruction of the curse damaged the book. A helpful mending charm from Boppy's clicked fingers later, and Chad was checking over the tome to make sure it had been completely repaired and had no missing text. With Voldemort's memories and his occlumency overpowered abilities, he was quickly able to check the lines for even a missing word. Which was why 5 minutes later he was angry at himself for missing something so obvious. The tome on Horcruxes that Riddle had read was missing half the pages of this one. Bloody Dumbledore had struck again, and Chad had missed such a glaringly obvious fact. Where did a young Tom Riddle get all his information? The restricted section at the school library. Dumbledore was spoon-feeding him just enough information to succeed, but not enough to become dangerous. When Chad was searching for a solution about anchoring the thug's disrupted soul back to his body, his first thought had been Horcruxes. But Tom's memories had been useless. The only thing he knew was a ritual to bind a small piece to an object and make the object indestructible or use another soul to leech off. There was only a part to test the anchor to the main soul, to keep the spirit of the deceased bound to the mortal realm and achieve immortality. The ritual handled the actual binding of the soul to the object, something that Chad could not reverse engineer to use for his own problems. But that had changed with the unedited version of Secrets of the Darkest Art, which according to it, Chad had already become an evil dark wizard of the highest order. It seems that any magic related to the soul had been designated as most evil since the medieval days. That was why there were no books on it or any mention of soul magic. Nobody knew about Lily's sacrificial protection spell or its effects except Dumbledore that had hoarded all the cool books with actual magical knowledge instead, or wand movements and Bastardi's Latin. Man, I'm so going to raid Dumbledore's personal library the first chance I get when I go to Hogwarts. It's a good thing he has to trave for ICW meetings. Chad thought to himself. When Chad finished the last page of the Secrets of the Darkest Art tome, he was both frustrated and relieved. There was no known spell to reattach a soul to a body. It could to an object or another soul, but not a soulless body. The author of this book had killed hundreds of test subjects in her pursuit and had only found ways to prolong it for a month at best. But that was only with spells. With the use of outside influence like the use of potions, that could be extended to a few years. But the ingredients were rare and costly, especially in this day and age where magical creatures and plants were sparse. Voldemort's method of drinking the blood of a unicorn would have only been viable for 2 years at most before Quirrell's body started to break down. He must have been brainwashed to the extreme to be so docile with an expiry date on his life, but most likely he was just fed some tripe about being fine once Voldemort had his own body. How a Horcrux could build its own flesh and bones with a wizard's life force and magic, but Chad could not anchor a soul to a soulless body was extremely frustrating. The only way that had worked permanently for Old Bullock, the author, was with the use of Phoenix Tears. She had not even created a ritual or a potion, just had the test subject swallow a single tear, and the immense healing powers somehow healed the connection between body and soul. Unfortunately, she only had one Phoenix Tear as they were rare as Rocking Horse *T and had failed to find another for further testing. Chad bet she wished she had used it for herself after transferring bodies. It could make you immortal. He could see how Phoenix Tears were the solution to his problem, considering they can heal basilisk venom, which destroys a Horcrux by eating away at the soul piece. All in all, his trip had been rewarding. He had gained access to Grimmauld Place, recruited Creature, put Mrs. Black in her place and found a solution to his soul problems. For now, his medical pursuits can take a back seat until he gained access to Phoenix Tears, which even today, with 2 known phoenixes, were still rare. Hell, Ollivander had only ever worked with 2 feathers, and he and Dumbles were supposed to be close associates. He also remembered to lock down Phineas Nigellus's portrait to stop him from spying for Dumbledore. It would possibly tip him off that someone had gained entry to the Black family house if he ever checked, but with a little luck, they would assume it was Malfoy and scheme against him instead. For now, Chad will focus on his next project, the expansion of his business empire. Crystal can continue to buy up land and fix up houses to rent out, but Chad wanted something that would put Elfenink on the map. A hotel that is so luxurious that it will make its competitors look like hostels in comparison. He could even make it a reward for his house elves. Maybe after an outstanding achievement or service, he could make them the manager of their own hotel. With 30 floors to keep clean, they will be in paradise. Alfheim Hotel, the homeland of the house elf. If you like this content, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you later, bye bye.